with that question. So many of you may have followed the news with elections last week, people out at the polls in Washington. There was a measure on the ballot, and it was essentially, to boil it way down, label or not labeled GMOs. And that measure did not pass in the state of Washington. A similar measure was introduced previously in the state of California. That measure was also defeated at the polls. And so what's going on with that? Anyone?
In California, the biotech industry and grocery manufacturers association have spent an extraordinary amount of money, $42 million in California and over $22 million in Washington, to fill the airways with commercials that tell people that their food is going to be more expensive if manufacturers have to label food. Our side doesn't have the money or the resources to put commercials on to counter that message. So there's a fear. Also, the fact that people really don't know about GMOs yet in America, which is really interesting. As Duane pointed out, the non-GMO papayas go to Japan, where they have labeling, and the consumers reject it. And we get the GMO stuff because we don't know we're eating it. And so it's not that it's accepted by the market, it's that it's flying under the market radar, and we don't get to know it. So that's essentially what's happening. We're outspent.
So Vanessa, I would actually have quite a different take on the outcome of the election. I think that as the question was placed in front of voters, both in California and in Washington, which, by the way, are two of our most environmentally leaning states, liberal, if you will. I don't really know how else to describe it, but states that have a high regard for the environment, and states that have some of the most rigorous environmental laws and some of the most rigorous enforcement we would characterize Washington and California. But when the question was put to voters there, and both sides expended significant sums to place their position in front of the voters in two of the most environmental leaning states in the nation said no. So they said no for what reason? Maybe because it was going to cost more. In Washington state, frankly, I think they said no because, on balance, the argument of the proponents of labeling didn't make their case. In editorial after editorial, the editorial boards, who are folks who dig in and understand before placing their position in public and standing behind it, said the other side didn't make their case. And so when informed, the voters said no. I think it's a powerful message. Frankly, I think it's a bellwether message that has likely changed the course of the debate here in the U.S.
The outcome of both of those votes were around 48 to 50%. 48 our side, 50% the other side. So I wouldn't say it was a landslide. Absolutely, consumers are rejecting labeling.
Do you have the final tally out of Washington?
I don't. I thought it was a further spread than that, but I could be wrong.
45-55 was the last I heard. It's a mail-in count state. Does anyone know the count?
No, it was 48-51.
48-51 was the final? Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And there's still ballots to be counted.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. It's been narrowing.
So it's narrowing.
Yeah.
The reason it was narrowing is because the ballots that were coming in from Seattle were behind the ballots that came in from the rest of the state. And Seattle is more green leaning, if you will, than the rest of the state is.
But the question wasn't, are GMOs bad for the environment or not? It was specifically on food labeling, and the grocery manufacturers had a big role to play in that.
And we should talk about labeling, whether it's appropriate to even label GMOs. And so we have a labeling law in the U.S. We actually do have one. And what it says is that if a product that is genetically engineered or altered in any other manner to be substantially different than foods that are generally accepted as safe or generally regarded as safe, there's actually a category, they're called grass foods. The first time I heard that, I was like, what's this stuff about grass, but it's generally regarded as safe, though it's a list of foods that have been eaten by folks for centuries. No food is perfectly safe. Don, you can't prove a food is safe. You can't prove potatoes are safe, whether they're genetically engineered or not. You can't do that. All you can do is assess their risks and give a measurement to the relative risk of that food relative to, if it's potatoes, maybe it's relative to tomatoes. Are potatoes safer than tomatoes? That's the kind of assessment. You can't say a tomato is safe or a potato is safe. And so we have a labeling law in the U.S. that says if it's substantially different than the existing grass food, then it must be labeled. Okay? GMOs are not substantially different. They have the same nutritional content. They have the same mineral content. In spite of what Don says, they don't have a higher formaldehyde content, and they are not required to be labeled because they are substantially equivalent.